What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and in today's video we're going to be wrapping up the Underworld series that I've been doing with Dave from Interpreting the Stars with Underworld Blood Wars. So it's finally time to talk about the fifth and final film in the series, or at least so far, Underworld Blood Wars. And it's been a lot of fun doing these movies with Dave from Interpreting the Stars. If you haven't been following along this series that we've done so far, yeah, we've covered all the other Underworlds up to this point, and this is the most recent one that came out. And this was actually a very first time watch for not only Dave, because this series overall was a first time watch for him, but this one was a first time watch for me. I had seen the first four, but I never got around to this one. So yeah, this should be an interesting one to talk about, and I'm very curious to see where they take the Underworld series moving forward, if we even get another movie, because sadly this franchise has just kind of been all over the place, and it feels like, you know, whatever narrative they were trying to set out to kind of accomplish with the first film ultimately just completely got scrapped, and the movies just start to feel like they lose their way, and what seems important in one film is completely thrown away in the next, and ultimately has created for a saga of films, 5 full films, that ultimately don't really feel like they have much purpose. There are elements about all of these films that I enjoy. There are elements about the visuals and the lore and these characters that I'm always about, but ultimately now having just binged them all again and kind of having them fresh in the mind and, you know, covering them here on the channel, I could definitely say that it's not a fantastic series. It's a series that, again, just feels convoluted at times and ultimately doesn't really have payoff for a lot of the things that are set up earlier in the series or that are meant to feel really important in the story. Ultimately they're kind of scrapped, and it just feels like every movie is just trying to be its own thing that builds on new lore and new characters and new threats, but ultimately isn't really giving you any payoff for the story and the huge stakes that are being set up in the previous films. Again, I want to thank my buddy Dave for joining me for these movies, and it's been a roller coaster of emotions when it comes to both of our opinions. I've been a little bit more on the positive side of the series, though I do have my negatives, but Dave has had a whole roller coaster of emotions, with certain films in the series being horrible to him and some actually being ones that he actually really enjoyed. So yeah, we're going to be hearing from Dave in a very short bit, because I'm actually going to have him take over the early part of this review instead of coming in about halfway as I usually do. But just to start this off, I want to say that yeah, this movie for me could have been a lot better. I will say that I think Dave enjoyed this film a little bit more than I did, though I will say I really enjoyed the way that this film looked. There's definitely great visuals. The movie came out in 2017, so it definitely has the benefit of more modern day filmmaking elements, though there are issues in the editing that made it feel a little bit like a movie that came out in the early 2000s. A lot of choppy editing and a lot of sequences that kind of took me out of it. Sometimes even in just dialogue sequences where it just feels like we're cutting back and forth to various people and their facial reactions to things that are being said a little bit too often, and it did feel a little bit jarring. But ultimately, this film does have a really solid action base when it comes to the action portion of the film, and it feels very much like some of the other films that I talked about in this series, where sometimes it feels like the action is really what the movie's about, and there are just things happening in the story to slowly push us towards those action sequences. This film is directed by Foerster, who is not somebody I'm familiar with. She's primarily worked on TV stuff, and yeah, this is the first time she's ever directed anything in this series. And you also don't have any of the original writers or people that were part of the storytelling of the first 4 films, and that much is very clear here. Once again, you have Kate Beckinsale as Selene, and then you have Theo James returning as well in this movie. And I forgot to mention Theo James in the last review. Yeah, you know, he was enjoyable in that film. I think he played a pretty solid role, but he wasn't given a whole lot to do, and so I do feel bad about not mentioning him in that last review, but I will say that he has more to do in this movie, which makes him a little bit more of a notable character to talk about. Like I mentioned, I have more things to talk about, but I definitely want to go ahead and hand the floor over to my buddy Dave from Interpreting the Stars so he can explain what this movie's all about, and then when I get back on screen, we'll talk a little bit more about my thoughts.
It's Dave back on Anthony's channel one more time to discuss the final film in the Underworld franchise, or is it Underworld Blood Wars? Selene is on her own now, as both vampires and Lycans alike are after her. The vampires are going after her in vengeance of her killing her own kind, and the Lycans, they want her for her blood to become invincible. Leading the Lycan clan is the incredibly powerful and mysterious Lycan Marius, whose source of power may be a shock to even Selene. First of all, a huge shout out and thanks to Anthony for inviting me over to your channel to discuss this entire series. Now, I thought that this was supposed to be the last movie, but the last line of the film makes me question that, as there was a bit of a cliffhanger, and Selene ends up saying, "Now it's just a becoming." Well, that just makes me think that if there was another Underworld film, it would undoubtedly be called Underworld Becoming. But if that never happens, I would not be surprised. Because even though I also enjoyed this movie, you can't just keep doing what the series has been doing for the last 2 entries and just ignore Michael. He wasn't in the last movie, and he wasn't in this either. And they did to Eve what they did to Michael last time. So she wasn't in this movie either. That was under the assumption that if Selene can't find her, then nobody can. And I don't know if that even falls in line with what we've experienced up to this point. It sounds like a weak excuse not to have the character come back at all. Without Michael or Eve, the heart of the film falls a bit flat. Of course, you sort of see them in this movie, and they do it like they do in Awakening, so fake actors with CGI faces, or just lookalikes in general, and it looks fake again. Why even bother at that point? There's more to that, and I'll get into the nitty-gritty soon. But I didn't want to completely gloss over the fact that I enjoyed it pretty similarly as to my experience with Awakening. I think in general I probably enjoyed Awakening more, since that was just a dumb fun action romp in general, while this reintroduced some of that exposition-y storyline seen in the other Underworld films. I mean, you could essentially say that it was the best of both worlds, so lots of great action, not too much plot lines to make it over-convoluted, but maybe just right, Goldilocks. I really enjoyed the Nordic sanction for the vampires and their lore specifically. Just a bunch of blonde vampires that are enlightened with knowledge of what comes in the afterlife, which, at the end of the day, explained those frosted tips that you had mentioned before, Anthony. Now, I actually really like that. It gave the franchise a touch of something more, even to the point of feeling pretty original. However, I did want to talk about the end of the film a little bit, so, you know, spoiler warning and everything. So this Marius guy, Marius, however you say it, you know, he's a scary hybrid werewolf Lycan creature, and he's as powerful as he is because he killed and drank Michael's blood. That is incredibly frustrating because they killed him off the last time too, only to tease he might come back in Blood Wars. And by the end of this movie, you find out that he was killed anyway. Pointless, frustrating end to Michael's story. They didn't get to say goodbye or reunite. No closure whatsoever there, and as for Eve, she shows up at the last second of this movie looking fake as ever, teasing another movie that'll probably never happen. Again, very frustrating move that feels rather pointless at the end of the day. At the same time, the film brought everything full circle. So if it did end here, it wouldn't be that bad because now there's new elders. Selene being one. That's cool. I mean, I liked that. That was poetic in a sense, but what they did to Michael is plain and simple trash. Overall, I would have to say that I liked this movie. I enjoyed it quite a bit actually, but I was let down when it came down to the heart of the series specifically. So anything regarding Michael or Eve or whatever, that stuff was rough, to put it lightly. I could deal with it in Awakening because I still had hope for Blood Wars to bring everything around, bring it to a head for a fantastic climax, and that didn't exactly happen. But at the same time, I'm not going to let that get to me and shroud my experience with the movie as a whole, which arguably was not bad. So let's talk about that. From a technical, unbiased perspective, I think that this movie looked pretty good. I might even argue that it's the best it's ever looked. It still had its issues, as I figured it always would with some of the visuals regarding the Lycans and everything, but some of the transformations by other Lycans were actually kind of cool. The look of Selene with them frosted tips. They're great! Everything else, once again, business as usual for an Underworld film. This score is the same as the unbiased score for Awakening, which is 78%. As for how I personally felt about the movie, otherwise known as my bias score, this is a little bit lower than my Awakening score because I didn't have as much fun as I did with Awakening. This was a little bit more serious. It went back to those days of having more exposition-y speech, which is fine, but my main concern and frustration came from the end of the film when we learned that Michael was indeed killed off and Eve as a whole was disregarded in the movie. So this score is, it's decent, but it could be a lot better at 76%, meaning that when we combine the two scores together, we come to the final rating of 77%. 77 out of 100 possible stars, meaning when I do a quick ranking of the entire series from worst to best, it would be Rise of the Lycans, which is garbage, Evolution, which is fine, but it's nothing special. Then I would go to the original Underworld film, which is the best of the original 3 movies, but still confusing and aged with its graphics. Then we go to this movie, Blood Wars, which is frustrating, but still a fun action film. And then finally, I end with Underworld Awakening. Definitely an imperfect film, no doubt, but none of them are perfect. It was just the most straightforward Underworld film, knew what it was, which was a dumb, fun action film, and it didn't even try to be anything more. That's why I love it. And that is my review for Underworld Blood Wars. Thanks one last time to Anthony for inviting me over to your channel. I do not know the next time that I'll be back on here, but hopefully not too long. And now I hand it back to Anthony to finish out his thoughts on Underworld Blood Wars. So take it away, Anthony, and again, peace out!
A big thanks to Dave for being here in this video. Loved having you on for this series, man, and you're right, it won't be very long until I have you back on the channel. It's been a blast talking about these movies with you because it's just been a range of emotions, and it's been great to always see how you're going to like something or not like something. And so with this one being the very first time watch for both of us, I was very, very curious, and you actually sent me over your portion for the review before I even saw the movie, and so I watched it right after you sent it over to me, and then I watched your portion of the review. And yeah, you definitely enjoyed the film more than me, but we do have a lot of the same criticisms, especially around the stuff with Michael and with the daughter Eve. Let's just go ahead and jump straight into that and say that that was without a doubt my least favorite portion of the entire film and this entire franchise. The first 2 films build on the premise that Michael is this very important entity, and then in the third one or fourth one, depending on how you want to count it, with the prequel in there, but with the third one, Awakening in the series, you have this individual who is now the daughter of Michael and Selene, and now you have another entity that's being set up to be this very important person. And they spent the whole last movie kind of wondering where Michael is, finding out that Michael was alive at the end of the movie and all that jazz, and running away from the Lycans and the vampires and the various individuals who are coming after her daughter Eve and wanting to get her blood to become whatever she is, to kind of use that to fuel their war. And so this movie is literally that all over again. It's just the whole idea of chasing after Eve, and of course there's different things going on here and all that jazz, but yeah, it was pretty disappointing to watch this movie and see that pretty much Michael is just killed. Like, he's killed off screen, and we kind of see it through like flashbacks here. Man, what a missed opportunity. I think Scott Speedman leaving the series ultimately just put a big foot up the ass of the writers, and they really were forced into a position where they didn't know what to do with this character, which led them to do something really, really stupid. It completely undermines the importance of his character in the previous films and kind of takes away from the importance of anything that happens in those movies, which is such a bummer, because if you watch those movies in and of themselves, they're entertaining, and they tell a story about somebody who is important, and for him to ultimately have been just captured and killed is just nonsense, and I hate that they did that. I think that Scott Speedman leaving the series ultimately just really caused the biggest hindrance that the series could ever have, and it led this series to kind of just be a big mess and feel very pointless. Then you have the daughter of Selene and Michael, who is a big part of the last movie, and in this movie she's off somewhere that even Selene doesn't know, and she shows up at the very end, similar to what David said, with a CGI face on an older person's body to supposedly show us that that's the same person, and it just doesn't sell you on it. It doesn't look like a real person. It doesn't even look like that person that it's supposed to be. Even the Scott Speedman like body double CGI face that they did on him in this movie it's almost worse than what they did in 2012. It almost looks worse, and almost looks less like Scott Speedman, and I just genuinely don't know what they were thinking when it comes to that portion of the story. I feel like they really should have made a case for Scott Speedman and Eve to come back. Another thing that was really disappointing for me with this film is the fact that the last film introduces the fact that humans now know that these creatures exist, that they're out there going after humans and vampires left and right, and that element of the story is pretty much thrown away in this movie, and with the movie called Blood Wars, and the movie ending with, you know, Selene giving one of her ending movie monologues, pretty much just saying, you know, like, oh, we fought our darkest battle. You know, it's like, this battle was fine. It was entertaining. It was cool action. There was definitely some great moments in here where I was literally audibly saying, like, fatality, because some of the kills are epic. But ultimately, it just kind of left me feeling like, what was really the purpose of anything that happened in this movie? And it really didn't feel like the stakes of the final battle were all that big. So I don't know, I feel like they kind of thought that they were kind of bringing it home, you know, giving us resolution, but ultimately they really didn't. And when it comes to the story side of things, I was really disappointed. Like I mentioned before, Theo James is given a lot more to do in this film as the character of David. I enjoyed him. I'm not in love with his character, but I liked him. I thought he was cool in the movie. You know, I really enjoyed a lot of the world building in this film as well. You know, we definitely lean a little bit more back into what the first two films were, with a lot of expository dialogue, a lot of big over-the-top scenes, and a lot of moments where we're just having a lot of dialogue about the politics of vampire living and all that jazz. And you know, I like that. I like that about this series. But ultimately, you know, 5 movies in, seeing that the main storyline has kind of been abandoned and we're still focusing on crap like this, it just feels redundant, and it just genuinely feels like an okay, weaker installment in the series, despite the fact that it does have some of the better cinematography, some of the better special effects all around, and the costume design, set design, the performances overall are really good. So it's one of those situations where the movie technically looks great and sounds great and, you know, is fun to watch, but the story just doesn't have much that I could ever see myself revisiting, not only this movie, but this series. You know, I was hoping, with the fact that I hadn't seen this 5th one, that there was going to be some sort of payoff to the story that I grew up enjoying as a kid, that I was able to just kind of enjoy at the time, because I didn't know really of much more and I was much younger. But to now be an adult and, you know, be a fan of stories, and to see that this movie series has 5 movies, you know, and really think about that and really feel like not much has happened. Every movie introduces a new set of characters and a new threat, and ultimately it kind of takes away from the importance. I almost wish that the main villain of this film had been Michael Sheen's villain character from Rise of the Lycans, who's the protagonist in that film, as well as the villain in the first Underworld, the character of Lycan. He's killed in the first Underworld, and I think that he was killed way too soon in the series, but I feel like it would have almost been more impactful for this film, and for the fact that our main villain is the one that actually kills Michael off screen. I feel like it would have been more powerful to have it had been a returning character, maybe somebody like Lycan, who wasn't decapitated or anything like that. He was killed, but they could have come up with some over-the-top fantasy way to bring him back, especially with some of the stuff that happens in this movie. And I just feel like it would have been a little bit more impactful if he was the one that maybe killed Michael, and maybe, you know, he had to be taken out one final time by Selene. And I don't know, I just feel like they missed an opportunity there, because our villain in the film is fine, but he's just another villain. Tobias Menzies is the guy who plays Marius, and he's the villain in this film, and, you know, he's a really strong Lycan that's a little bit different from the really strong Hulk-like Lycan from the last movie. But yeah, you know, it's just another really badass Lycan character that ultimately, you know, he's just another one. Like, that's just kind of how I feel about the villains in this series. It just feels like they could have done a lot more. I feel like they should have brought back a returning character. And to be 5 movies deep and really only have Selene as the main returning character that you really care for, it is a damn shame, because I think Scott Speedman and even the character of Eve from the last film, the daughter, could have been characters that really, you know, were fleshed out over the course of multiple films and could have told a really great story. And it would have been awesome to see the 3 of them facing off against some sort of big threat at the end of the movie. You know what I mean? Call it Blood Wars, maybe have it be a war between the vampires, the Lycans, and the humans. You know, have Scott Speedman, have Eve there, you know, have these characters there alongside Selene, you know, Kate Beckinsale. And it would have just felt a little bit more epic. It would have felt like there was really some sort of payoff, you know, to what we've seen thus far. And ultimately, I just didn't feel like there really was. So yeah, as you can tell, I'm fairly disappointed with the narrative portion of this film. But I do want to highlight the fact that the film does have really great, competent action sequences, some really interesting lore, good performances. Again, the movie looks good. The costume design is always great. And yeah, you know, I enjoyed the special effects and all that. It's just that the story just didn't do it for me. Another thing that kind of disappointed me going into the movie is the predictability on so many fronts. Now, of course, I didn't know exactly what was going to happen when it comes to characters like Michael and various things like that, but a lot of the marketing for this movie, especially all the posters, have Kate Beckinsale with blonde hair, or a portion of her hair being blonde, like blonde tips. You know, I was waiting the whole movie for that to happen, and it practically just happens in the last 10-15 minutes of the movie. And I just found that to be super disappointing because you know what's about to happen. You have the main villain killing Selene like a little bit past the halfway point of the movie. She's literally killed, and right before that, we had just been introduced to a completely different type of vampire that all have like almost bleached blonde hair, like almost white, snow white hair. And yeah, they showed this process where they almost like mummify people who are dead but not dead, and they kind of go into this afterlife kind of different plane of life and reality. And when they come back, they're kind of, you know, more enlightened, and their hair color changes. And so, you know, as soon as she dies, you know, oh, that's exactly what's gonna happen. She's gonna come back with those blonde frosted tips that I saw in the posters. And I kind of just wish they hadn't shown any of that in the posters, because ultimately it's such a small portion of the film, and majority of the film is her looking exactly like she did in all the other films. And it would have been a nice surprise in the film to see her get resurrected in that way, when ultimately as soon as she dies, it's like instantly like, okay, this is how she gets the blonde hair. She's going to be put through that process. And you know, I'm not necessarily saying that I thought that how she got the blonde hair was stupid. It's just the fact that they put the blonde hair all over the marketing, and so there's literally no surprise when it comes to how she gets it as soon as it's introduced in the movie. You know what I mean? Ultimately, I just feel like the movie felt very lazy in its storytelling, and it really left me disappointed. Now, I don't do rankings here on the channel, but Dave did one here, and I figured I'd have some fun with it. I did a score, I believe, on the last one, which I don't really do scores, because I don't really feel like, for me personally, scoring and ranking is all that definitive. I feel like at the end of the day, it comes down to what I'm feeling on that day. You know, Star Wars is my favorite thing of all time. Anybody knows that. But, you know, I always say Empire Strikes Back is my favorite Star Wars, but it all depends on the day. You know, I grew up in the prequel age. If I ever want to just see a Star Wars movie with a lot of, you know, action and some great visuals, I might throw in Revenge of the Sith. That might be my favorite for the day. Or I might feel like, you know what, I just want some really pure classic, just simple Star Wars. And then A New Hope is my favorite Star Wars for the day. You know, it just always changes. I never really stick to a specific ranking or rating system, because I feel like, for me personally, that stuff always changes. But if I had to give a ranking for this series overall, I would say that my favorite one is still Underworld. I would say the original Underworld is still the best one, and I'm honestly going to say that Awakening is probably my second favorite of the bunch, with Rise of the Lycans right after that as my third favorite. Then I will put Underworld Evolution and Underworld Blood Wars kind of tied for my last spot in the series. And you know what's really disappointing about that with this one is that there's so much about the way that this film looks and feels that is substantially better than any of the other films, but ultimately it just doesn't really have the story that ever really got me super gripped, though it was still entertaining. And ultimately, even though I put it near the bottom of the list for me, these are all entertaining, fun movies. I'm a fan of vampires and werewolves and big fantasy action, and these movies definitely deliver on that. So yeah, that's gonna be my thoughts on this movie, my thoughts on this series, and it's been a lot of fun talking about these with Dave from Interpreting the Stars. So you guys can find the link to his channel down below in the description box. Go give him some love, let him know I sent you. But for now, I will leave you guys. Sorry for the very long video. I hope you guys enjoyed hearing us ramble about this franchise, and I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. Are you a fan of this movie? Are you not a fan of this movie? How do you feel about the way that they handled Michael and Eve in terms of telling their story and following up after Awakening? Do you hope that we get a sixth film in the series? I know that I kind of want us to at this point, but if we do, I really feel like it needs to be the last one. Selene needs to die or something. There needs to be finality to this series, because it really is starting to feel aimless. So that's going to be my thoughts. A big thanks to you guys for watching. Hit that like button, comment your thoughts, subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.